Everyone, welcome to World City and this panel on designing for justice. My name is Charles T. Brown, and I will be moderating our conversation today with three of the world's most amazing people and professionals working to center justice in projects around the globe. Those three panelists include Dr. BAHIYYAH Maroon, who is the CEO of Polis Institute, Andrew King, Chief Design Officer at LeMay, and TAMIKA Butler, founding principal of TAMIKA L Butler Consulting. Right now, we're going to start with TAMIKA Butler. TAMIKA, in your own words and experiences, what does it mean to design with justice in mind?
Thanks so much, Charles. Good morning, everyone. I'm TAMIKA Butler, as Charles said, and I'm located in Los Angeles, California, on unceded Tongva land. And I am joining you bright and early because designing for justice is something near and dear to my heart. I started my career as a community lawyer, and in that practice of really listening to people, bringing justice to people where they were, literally in communities, with the focus specifically on Black folks and on queer communities. And no matter where I've traveled in the world, I tend to lead with that frame of justice. I am a genderqueer Black woman, so I have a life experience that tells me what injustice is, that tells me how unsafe it could be to just be your authentic self. So when I think of designing for justice in my planning practice, designing for justice, there is no toolkit. There is no one way to do it. It is, where are you located situationally? Who are you in community with? Who are you building trust? And then designing for justice is letting those folks lead you, realizing that it's not our job as design experts to empower folks in community, but our job is actually to see the power within those communities and collaborate with people, to co-power with people, and to design the world that they want as they see it, instead of riding in on our white horses and saying this is what it must be.
Thank you for that. I'm curious, why co-powering instead of empowering?
Yeah, I just really see empowering as a colonial mindset. I think language is so important in what we do, and empowering. I as an individual can certainly say I feel empowered, but it is not on me to empower others, because it still feels like I have determined that I am the one with the power. And if people are lucky enough, I will bestow it upon them and empower them to do the work. It's not recognizing the inherent power in communities, right? True justice, true freedom. I'm Black, and we've been trying to get free. And so true liberation comes from allowing and understanding that self-determination is important. And so for me, co-powering is recognizing that power is already there, and that it's not on me to give it to people. It's on me to respect and trust that people have it, and to go on the journey with them.
I absolutely love that. Thank you so much for that. Dr. BAHIYYAH Maroon, what does it mean for you to design with justice in mind?
Well, first, I want to say thank you, Charles, and of course, thank you to the World City organizers for having this event and this particular panel. At Polis Institute, our team works with stakeholders who care about placemaking and revitalization that genuinely creates racial equity and economic mobility. And when we talk about designing for justice, we're concerned not only with the outcome, we're also concerned with the process. So ensuring that in the process of constructing place, we are giving people access to opportunity, and we are changing the dynamics of economic structures while we go about changing the dynamics of the places in which we live.
I love that. So not just a focus on outcomes, but also process. Was it a particular process or experience that led you to understanding the importance of not just focusing on one, but focusing on both outcome and process?
Yes, I refer to it personally as the security guard issue, which is As a Black woman, when I walk into some of the most spectacular venues in the world, I can look around and see other Black people, people of color, in the position of security guard. But I cannot necessarily go back of house in those spectacular institutions and be assured that the executive leadership team, that the management team, that the marketing team will also have representation of people of color. And so when we're talking about designing for justice, it means that all of the revenue, all of the financial profitability that comes into the process of creation, as well as the career and the economic opportunities that come in the process of managing our places, right? All of these need to be conceptualized as opportunities to create equity, rather than the sort of traditional approach of bringing in the voices of people of color so that we can check a box and say that we've heard from them, and then not actually creating these systemic opportunities for equity within the dynamics of management.
Love that. Dr. King, not Dr. King, but Andrew, perhaps you'll channel Dr. King in your response. How have you centered, not how have you centered, but what does it mean to you to design for justice or design with justice in mind?
Thank you, Charles, and again, thank you to World City for organizing this. Our trajectory, as we mentioned before, I'm with LeMay, which is a very large architecture transdisciplinary practice, and I work in academia and have done for 30 years. Currently with McGill University, and I guess my trajectory into designing for justice has been one that sort of moved from a more standard narrative design architect, design excellence role, trying to do great buildings, trying to do great projects, and trying to get whatever degree of recognition and what that means in terms of projecting forward a more poetically beautiful built environment. But in the last few years, it has transitioned into something around the importance of new definitions of justice within those environments. So I completely applaud Tamika and Bahiyya's comments. I can't be more succinct than that in terms of how the world really needs to respond to that. What we've done in the world that I'm engaged in, and I have, and I can help forward, is build fieldwork, which is our research and innovation wing, around many of these issues. So essentially become a collaborative platform, and that's how we see ourselves, a collaborative platform where we build partnerships, we bring tools forward, we create mechanisms for this notion of co-creation, this notion of co-making, this notion of co-powering, I guess, is the way I think Bahiyya put it. It's a beautiful, beautiful word, and that's how we see that functioning. I mean, that comes really personally from my engagement with my partner, who's a conceptual artist and a woman from an indigenous background here in Canada. And there's very, very important and powerful issues within the indigenous community that have percolated very far forward in the last few years. But also the fact that her concern hasn't been so much focusing on that specific issue, but focusing on how art, how culture, how our narratives really need to be recalibrated within our cities, so within our public space, within our institutions, within our art world, and the notion that public memory has to be much more inclusive, much more resilient, much more if you are an individual of any identity, of any understanding of the world, of any degree of otherness, you can find stories that actually are about your history as much as anybody else's. So we find ourselves in a position where we can actually work on big public projects, or we can work on significant research projects, which hopefully I'll be able to speak about here. But for me, this heartfelt earnestness is focusing itself in the powerful tool around applied design research, and I'm hoping we're managing to create partnerships with the Indigenous communities in Calgary, with the autistic communities here in Montreal, with major public institutions and women's organizations here in Montreal too, around specific projects that push these ideas forward, and then we can generate narratives around those. That's sort of where we're going, and I hope we're making some meaningful contribution.
Well, let's stay with you for a second before I go back to Tamika and then Dr. Maroon. Tamika pointed out the importance of co-powering. Dr. Maroon talked about this idea of a security guard and the importance of diversifying, staff and having proper representation, not only internally, but also externally through your efforts. Historically, architecture, engineering, and other organizations and sectors have been dominated by males, many of whom are white males. So how are you centering justice not only in your work, but also within your institution to, combat that unfortunate reality as it relates to history?
I could talk a little bit about LeMay and fieldwork and what we're trying to do here. But I'd like to talk a little bit about just 2 seconds on my personal history. I worked in Europe for many years. I worked in Berlin for about 8 years, and before that I worked in London for Zaha Hadid, one of the best known female architects in the world, a Pritzker Prize winner. And my experience in Europe was that I worked for more women than men for the first 10 years of my career. So for me, that was a sort of galvanizing thing. There was never any distinction. And it was only when I started repracticing or moved back to North America and started practicing here that I became aware of the discrepancy. I'll have an architectural class of students that will be over 65% women. And then when we find ourselves in practice for various reasons, women are underrepresented at least as you move. I guess I don't want to speak, if you accept the notion of hierarchy, there are certain hierarchies, and at a certain point, women find their way out of large practice for some reason. It is something we, within my firm, are really trying to find mechanisms to change, and that's an immediate problem. It's one that we can deal with pretty quickly, and it's one that we can deal with by putting mechanisms in place. Whether there's gender inclusivity, we have a gender inclusivity research project that's broad. It moves across the U.S. Julia Pascuda within my studio is running that, and we do have the opportunity. And when I say gender, I mean gender identity. I mean all the issues around personal identity are something that we're trying to make sure we have mechanisms for within the firm that we're completely inclusive. Other mechanisms are where we have to work with the institutions, the academic institutions, and understand how we're going to create mechanisms or push forward mechanisms for a broader inclusivity. Canada has the challenges of indigeneity, and in Canada itself, we have an architecture school itself in Sudbury that's focused on Indigenous groups and Indigenous design history, design culture, but also on supporting the Indigenous population. And then within the firm, essentially, we're just trying to create an ED plus I. I know that's EDI is, as soon as something becomes a kind of acronym or becomes 3 letters that you can put together, it becomes something that is almost difficult then to push forward as a tool, but we're working very hard to try and do that. It's still fundamentally an issue. I have an anecdote. When I worked with another firm, another very large firm that had a very large office in St. Louis, I can remember getting off a plane from Montreal, getting onto a plane, and in the journey between the airport and the office, realizing that 70% of the people that I saw were people of color. And then walking into the office and realizing that maybe there were 2 people of color in an office of 170 people. And for me, it was salient, and it was something that I brought up in the first board meeting, and of course everybody was aware we need to push it forward. These anecdotes aren't solutions, but we are trying to push forward a series of mechanisms to pull solutions forward. And I'll talk about Place de Montréal maybe a little bit in our conversation about what we're trying to do there in a very meaningful and poetic way. Anyway, I'm speaking too much. Sorry, Charles. I don't think you expected it.
No, that was great. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Andrew. Tamika, moving back to you, how have you specifically centered, this justice lens in your work? Please share for us specific examples.
I think Dr. Maroon spoke to it really, best thus far. You have to be thinking about outcomes and process. And I think too often people say, I want to do justice, right? And even if their heart is in the right place, they get to this place of outcomes immediately. They get to, how can we solve this? And a couple of things happen. They get overwhelmed because they're like, wow, like racism and sexism and heterosexism, this stuff is hard. And it's like, well, no shit, it's hard. Like, what do you think it is to live every day in this body? Like you got lit for one summer because you were stuck inside, and all of a sudden you had to acknowledge that our people keep dying, not because it started happening all of a sudden, but because now you couldn't escape it. And now after the summer, you're like, whoa, this is tough. Yes, right. And so I think that's one of the things that happen. People say, let's just get straight to solutions. Let's just get straight to the outcomes, and they get exhausted. Or they just get so particularly focused on how are we going to solve this problem. And I really think that's an issue of whiteness. And when I say whiteness, I don't just mean white people. I mean people who are operating within the constructs of white supremacy, and that's a lot of us, frankly, right? And I think this privilege of whiteness is, you've been taught and you've seen examples throughout life that if you work hard, that you'll get that outcome you want. So then you become focused on that outcome. Whereas for many folks of color, we've had the experience that it doesn't matter how hard we work. It doesn't matter if we do all the right things and get all the right credentials. It doesn't mean we're not focused on process. It means that we're thinking about the process, and we're thinking about things outside the process, and we're trying to figure it out. And so I think, what does it look like? It looks like that you're intentional or unknowing. Even if I don't know what the solution is going to be, I'm making this part of everything I do. I'm making it part of every conversation I have, every thought I have, right? And I think sometimes people say, but why does everything have to be about race? And that's a great question. Let's ask the white folks in power who have constructed a world in which we always check a box. We always have to identify. We always have to be put into groups. And so, my philosophy on how you do it is, you have to focus on process and outcomes. You have to get past this place of what's your intent. Well, our intent was good, so sorry, right? And I always say to people, you throw a ball to your friend in the park and it swerves and it hits me. It doesn't really care what your intent was. And in that park, most people would come over and be like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. When your nose is bleeding, they don't say, well, I can't believe your nose is bleeding. It's not like I intended to do it. But we do that when we talk about justice. We say, but this is my intent. And so I think it's about getting beyond intent and thinking about, how do we actually do this work? How do we hold ourselves accountable? And how do we realize that this isn't just the work of a few people? This isn't just the work of the folks on our team who have disabilities, who are Indigenous, who are queer, who are Black, right? This isn't just racialized people's work. We just got through a pandemic where we talked about, well, we're not really through it, but people like to think we through it. But they talk about essential workers, and so many essential workers were people of color. And we depended on them. We deemed them essential. And so we have to get past this framework that it's just those types of folks' work to do justice, because if they're essential and we all depend on them, then it's essential that we're all thinking about justice, that we're all doing this work, and that we're all doing it each and every day. And I think it's really about a practice. It's about a lifestyle. It's about being brave. And it's about realizing that you're not going to get it perfect, but you can't be so afraid to get it wrong. You can't be so afraid for someone to call you out, and realize that when they do, they're doing that with love often, right? Because they don't have to tell you wreck, but you have to be willing to do those things, not get it right every time, and keep pushing. This has to be lifelong work.
Thank you. Dr. Maroon, like you, Tamika, and Mr. King, a lot of you were doing this work before, George Floyd's murder. You've mentioned you've been doing this work, and your colleagues, 20 plus years. How have you centered justice in your work specifically? And what challenges have you had to overcome during that process?
Well, what we do at Polis Institute, which I just want to say, I joined the Polis Institute team as a consultant about 4 years ago and came on as the chief executive officer just this past January. And for me, having done this work for so long, being able to come home to a team that genuinely creates equity and justice has just been spectacularly inspiring. And I'm so appreciative of the Institute and the team that I work with. We utilize a three-pointed process. We work with two kinds of placemakers. And on the one side, we have professional placemakers. These are our A&E firms, our municipalities, developers, etc., foundations. And on the other hand, we have community placemakers. And that's the first step, is really understanding that community members are placemakers in their own way, and they have been creating place well before development teams descended somewhere to start building. So we center both kinds of placemakers. And then we look at the first step is equitable inclusion. And what we do here is we go through community and we identify, recruit, hire, and train engagement ambassadors. So these are folks who are going to do the ground game. They're going to get the word out. You know, there are meetings coming up, there are charrettes coming up, there are decisions coming up. So these engagement ambassadors are from within the community. They are the community placemakers. We also recruit, hire, and train community-based research assistants. This is ensuring that people are paid for their work. It's ensuring that there is a transfer of knowledge. We never work in a community and don't transfer knowledge. So all of the research skills that are necessary for community surveys, community dialogues, analysis of what community residents have to say, all of that is incorporated into the community placemaking ecosystem, if you will. So we've got our research assistants, we've got our engagement ambassadors, and then we come along, and so these are people of color who are being paid for their work, paid for their time, and they will become then the conduit into the next phase, which is amplification of voices. And this is bringing the whole spectrum of community placemakers into the decision-making and the visioning process. And so we're able to overcome some of these systemic issues like gatekeepers in communities who don't speak for all community members, but would like you to think that they do. It's able to overcome this idea that we're gonna have one charrette at one time and we've heard everyone. We have a holistic process that brings community placemakers through the entire stream work, right, of placemaking. And then the most central feature of it is enabling power sharing, right? And so this is where we have to be very, very clear with professional placemakers, our municipalities, our developers, our A&E. You've got to be very clear. What are the decisions that you are willing to share with your community placemakers? And you have to be upfront about what those decisions are, and then you have to be willing to hold to that. So we're never working in a situation where we're saying, come and donate your time to this community meeting. Let's hear everything that you have to say and then build the building we were going to build anyway. We're ensuring that there's a process in which there's accountability to those decisions. And the last thing that I want to say is that creating genuine justice in placemaking processes means looking at the long tail of the work that's at hand. And typically there's anywhere from an 8 to a 15-year process to actually get a building open, to actually get a landscape open. So you've got that design conceptualization. That's a 3 to 5 year phase all the way over here before you're even looking at drawings and permitting and so forth. And so what we're saying is, you know ahead of time, these are the subs, these are the trades, these are all of the jobs that are going to come on hand to build this place. You know ahead of time, these are all of the jobs that are going to be in that place, in that venue, in that building. And you can utilize that time, 5 to 8 years, as an on-ramp to allow community placemakers to get into the pipeline of certification, of training, of education, of preparation to be the people who take those jobs in the construction, in the trade, in the building management, and whatever kinds of particular business and industry will actually occupy the building. So when these buildings open, to Andrew's point, and you're walking in and you're saying there's 2 people in the building who look like us, and then everyone outside, you know, that doesn't make any sense.
That's a great analogy. I want I want to make sure Andrew has an opportunity to respond there as well. But Andrew, as it relates to participatory design processes and your challenges, how are you centering equity or justice within your work? What challenges have you faced and how have you overcome them in 2 minutes or less?
I'll try to do this in 2 minutes or less. Intent, process, and outcomes. I think that's a great way. Tamika and Bahiyya have been framing the conversation in that world. This notion about being in front of the work, and Bahiyya's or Dr. Maroon's comments about actually finding yourself in front of the work. Architecture and design has a kind of time frame. What we're trying to do with field work is actually push ourselves well in front of that time frame, actually engage the autistic community, actually have conversations around queer space, actually speak with at the front end of academic and critical research on gender inclusive design through a broad understanding of issues. What we're trying to do is say that the design process, the making, the sort of retelling of or the recalibration of our public memory doesn't start with somebody giving you a public space project and then you just designing it. It starts with you understanding these stories in a nuanced way. And then within those stories, as you move ahead, as you move forward, I guess it does talk to intent a little bit, because the intent has to be there, but the intent has to almost recalibrate itself almost immediately. So actually being at the front of the issues and understanding that the adult autistic community has social challenges, economic challenges, and challenges of space, and then responding to a project that responds to that. Place de Montreal for us is sort of the hood ornament of that in a way. I hope that's a reference. That's an old reference now. That's an old man reference for sure. But it's a kind of representation of that, because it actually declassifies the inclusion and just says there's a broader understanding of our history as a city that has to include women. Place de Montreal means the place of the women of Montreal. It's a gender-based language. And it means actually the recalibration of that space through the work that we've done with the conceptual artist Angela Silver, creating a kind of curatorial position that is radically inclusive. It includes all women. So there's an art strategy and a design strategy that includes, that is somehow inclusive of all the women of Montreal, while focusing on 21 specific women builders of the city. Those are women of color, those are women of indigeneity, women who were slaves, women who were nuns, women who were politicians early on in the process, women who were victims, the 14 victims of the misogynist massacre at Polytechnique here in Montreal over 20 years ago. So this notion about maybe I'm going over 2 minutes. I guess we have to be in front of the problem, and then we have to create projects that are radically recalibrating our historical stories. We can pull as many statues down as we want, but it's what goes up in the place of those statues that I think is important in terms of our public memory.
You know, for the sake of time,
I don't think I answered your question. Sorry, I don't think I answered your question at all, Charles. But
you certainly answered. But in terms of time here, let's stick with you for a second, Andrew. Each of you are, rock stars or superstars in this space. I'm curious, Andrew, for you, who do you look to for inspiration? 30 seconds or less.
Two things. The Indigenous community, the Indigenous culture here in Canada has absolutely had to recalibrate itself over the residential schools issue. I'm not sure how familiar you are with this, but it's both a terrible tragedy, but also a galvanizing thing. And it has allowed, not allowed, that's the wrong word. I know Tamika spoke about that word. It's brought forward many stories and many salient, calm, and very, very eloquent narratives from the leaders of the Indigenous community here in Canada. But secondly, my inspiration is working closely with artists who are interested in this issue, specifically our collaborators with Place de Montreal, Angela Silver, in terms of a much broader, much deeper, much more nuanced understanding about how these stories can be recalibrated. That's where I find inspiration right now. Architecture seems shallow sometimes in response.
Thank you. Dr. Maroon, where do you find your inspiration? 30 seconds or less, so I can end with Tamika.
Well, all over the United States, there are historic African-American communities that have been with us since the mid-1800s. And I look to those communities to inspire and to really center on the kind of power that we've always had. And then I look to the generations after me. I look at young Black and Brown folks out there doing the work and really pushing boundaries, and it both keeps me inspired and young.
Thank you. Tamika closes out. Who do you look to for inspiration?
Yeah, thanks, Charles, and thanks to this awesome panel and World City for having us and centering justice on this last day. I will say, as Issa Rae said, I'm rooting for everybody Black. And I always tell people, if there's a natural disaster, look for a woman of color, because we always make it and we always bring other people with us. And so that's really where I find my inspiration. And then I look at my 3-year-old son and my 7-month-old daughter. And I know what it's been to be Black in this world, where you have to worry, public space, is it public for everyone? Public space where we we started on the auction block, as Jay Pitter said, and where we're always trying to find where our place is. I want them to be in public space and be free and have joy and be their full selves. And I'm doing this work for them, and that's really my inspiration.
Thank you all for joining us today. Special thanks to World City and my panelists here for discussing designing for justice. I hope that you all enjoy the rest of this amazing event, and I look forward to seeing you in person someday soon. Thank you.